Hi everyone, I keep getting 1,000 questions every single day from people that find uniques for the first time in their Diablo 4 playthrough, especially, for example, rogues that find a Windforce or something like that, and they always come back to my stream and ask, hey, is that a good item? What should I do with this? Can I play this or that? So I figured I maybe just go through all of them and give my opinion about these uniques. I have to tell you, generally, most uniques are pretty bad in this game, at the very least for rogues. There are some exceptions, and there are also exceptions for other classes, but most of the time they just don't really have great stats. They have an effect that is like, yeah, maybe comparable, maybe slightly better than like a legendary. So the all-round package is usually quite bad, especially when compared to real endgame items. But not everything is really terrible. Some of those uniques do have their uses, but usually they are very specialized in what you use them for. So let's get into it. The first unique here is Cowl of the Nameless. This is actually one of the better uniques on a rogue. It does give you lucky hit chance and also has cooldown reduction, which is kind of like a must-have stat on a helm. And it has some other small perks like maximum energy, crowd control, dexterity. Nothing too crazy. So the stats have at least like the most important one, and then you have a lucky hit effect. And this lucky hit effect can be quite valuable for some builds, depending on what you play. Normally, I would say most rogue builds are not really too based on lucky hit. There are some lucky hit effects. For example, you have stuff like innovation, or you have certain legendary aspects that, for example, that Umbrus that procs Dark Shroud stacks, or we have maybe exposure passive. But generally, if you use a very lucky hit based build, then this can be a pretty important item. I have not used it too much myself because I've been playing hardcore, and for hardcore I think the stats are not good enough. So you usually want to have life on your helm, you usually want to have something like percent armor on your helm. And also, for example, lately I've been playing some builds that are very strongly based around Shadow Imbue, so I wanted to have Shadow Imbue ranks on the helm. We do lose quite some stuff, but especially for softcore builds that produce a lot of lucky hits, this is effectively an offensive item in a defensive slot, so this can be quite valuable. Then we have the Razorplate. I mean, Thorns, rogue. Yeah, I don't think I would try. The main issue with this is it's just like there's no synergy on rogue for Thorns. There's like nothing that you can really do with it. You don't have taunts and all that stuff like a barb does. There is a barb Thorns build that is pretty good, and Thorns actually in general can scale pretty high in this game, but I don't really trust this too much on a rogue. I think that especially survivability will be a big issue. You effectively take like more than double the damage by not having a real chest piece, and then you want stuff to hit you. Not a good combo. Then we have Windforce. This is probably like one of the first items that everyone ever finds on a rogue. It is absolute trash, so let me tell you that much. First of all, it's a bow. Bows in general are trash in this game because of the damage to distant enemies, which is a very weak stat that doesn't even work for most of the builds. And crossbows have vulnerable damage, which is like the best stat in the game. And then this thing has even more distant damage, has all stats, which is kind of okay. It has core skill, which is kind of okay. It has the impetus passive, which is very weak passive in my opinion. It's only really something for like speed farming, where you just go from pack to pack and kind of one-shot screens. But with that weapon, you won't really get there, I think. Because this lucky hit effect, yeah, 20% chance on a lucky hit to deal double damage and knock back the target. The knockback does have some utility, so you can proc concussive with that. And you can even proc something like Umbral, because the knockback also counts as a crowd control momentarily. So you can get resources from the Umbral ring, for example. But the problem with that is this proc rate is just like omega low. Like, you have to see that this is lucky hit, so it multiplies the chance with the skill's lucky hit chance. If you look at Rapid Fire, for example, Rapid Fire has 20% lucky hit, Windforce has lucky hit, so this multiplies for a total chance of 4% to trigger per arrow. So you have to shoot 25 arrows, you have to shoot 5 rapid fires to get 1 knockback and 1 time double damage on 1 arrow on 1 guy. Yeah, this is Windforce, guys. Barrage has basically the same problem with the lucky hit, but you also produce the ricochets more easily, and you can split them, so you have a bit more arrows. But even so, even if you play like a combo point barrage, let's say, and you shoot like 8 arrows, and then they ricochet, so if something like, let's say, 20 hits, even so, like it takes like, yeah, almost 2 uses or so to actually get 1 trigger of Windforce on 1 target. So there is Penetrating Shot. Penetrating Shot actually has decent amount of lucky hit, especially with combo points. It goes up to 80%. And let's say with a bunch of extra items or so, a bit of lucky hits, chances on your gear, you can actually reach 100% lucky hit. Well, that actually does have a little bit of viability. So then you have like a true 20% chance to get double damage. But again, this is like a best case scenario of maybe plus 20% DPS. But first of all, you have all the problems with the stats on this item, so that alone loses you probably like 30% DPS. And then you also don't have a doubled legendary aspect, where you usually put something like Edge Masters or some other like really important affix on your two-handed weapon, so that you actually have really high damage. So I think equipping Windforce probably nerfs a character by something like 50%. Keep that in mind. Then we have Skyhunter, a next bow. So this is actually a pretty interesting one. It gives you a guaranteed crit the first time you hit an enemy, and you also gain energy back if you had maximum stacks of precision. And on top of that, it has okay stats. Again, it has a distant damage because it's a bow, but it has a good chunk of dex. It has marksman skill damage, crit damage, exploit passive. This stuff is not really bad. It is missing vulnerable damage, but okay. But the effect is actually relatively interesting. So I think Skyhunter is a much better bow. It's also a bit more rare than the Windforce, but it's also suffers from kind of the same problem. The thing is, just critting with the first arrow is not really all that valuable for barrage and rapid fire yet again. These skills fire a lot of arrows, so each individual arrow doesn't really do all that much damage. So basically those two skills are already out by default almost, and we are back to penetrating shot. So again, we play a penetrating shot build, usually with combo points, and then Skyhunter can be kind of okay, I would say. But then you have the problem that you have to build combo points, and when you have to build combo points, you're going to do it probably with a ranged basic skill. And then when you use a ranged basic skill, it will eat up your precision stacks, because usually you shoot into a pack, you get a lot of crits, you have 5 precision stacks, and then you use your puncture, and well, your precision stacks are gone. So F. So in that case, it's going to be pretty tough to actually make Skyhunter work at all. I think the only way to do this would be a non-combo point, penetrating shot, farming build of some sort, where you just like a blast through easy content. Like if you just like, you know, run through and you're like super overpowered, you have like inner sight specialization, let's say, and you just like right click penetrating shot into a pack and everything dies. That can kind of work, I guess, but then you have the same old problem. Penetrating shot is already extremely weak on the boss. And with this, you have 0 help on the boss, you don't have combo points, you don't have a power on the weapon. So if you ever encounter a boss fight, you're going to be in trouble. But yeah, there is a little bit of a niche for Skyhunter, I would say. Then we have Condemnation. This is a really powerful item. So the stats are not the most amazing, but the effect is really good. Up to 40% multiplicative increased damage when you spend 3 combo points. This is basically best in slot for every single combo point based build, unless you have a really good, like, you know, 5th or 6th best legendary aspect for your build that you really want to include. And you can use like a sword that has like, you know, crit, vulnerable, these kind of stats. Then that might be competitive. So like a best in slot weapon can beat Condemnation, I would say, especially for ranged builds. But for the most part, most combo point based builds on Rogue use Puncture to build those combo points. And Puncture is a ranged skill, but it actually uses your melee weapons. So it uses this Condemnation, so you can get this effect where you have a chance to trigger 3 combo points. So sometimes you use a single attack, you get those 3 combo points, and if you pay attention to that, you can immediately fire your penetrating shot, for example. This is really powerful. The big problem with that is there is no good UI indicator for this. So the only way to actually notice if you get this proc is by constantly looking down at your combo points on the bottom. I think this item would be way cooler, way better if there was actually like some kind of character effect, some flash or I don't know what, that makes it really obvious that it triggered, so that you can actually look at the gameplay and not only at the UI at the bottom. Aside from this, yeah, as I said, it's pretty good. It has basic skill attack speed. You use a lot of basic skills in a combo point build. You have a bit of crit chance against injured enemies. That's alright. You have damage with dual wielded weapons, and there's core skill. That's alright, I guess. In general, Flurry is usually played with combo points, Penetrating Shot is usually played with combo points, and there are some other options like Rapid Fire and Barrage that can also play combo points. And for all of those builds, if you use combo points, Condemnation is really good. Then we have Asheara's Khanjar. This is another dagger. I think this is a relatively good item. So it has an attack speed proc, gives you up to 30% attack speed, which unfortunately only really works for melee builds. So you have to play like Twisting Blades or Flurry, or some melee combo point builder, but I wouldn't really suggest start with a ranged build, maybe with Barrage. But yeah, for the most part, the stats are not the greatest, but lucky hit on a weapon can maybe lead to some interesting outcomes. I've used this, for example, on Twisting Blade's Death Trap, and the lucky hit does help a little bit with the exposure procs. And we have the movement speed on elite kill, so this really speeds up your farming. It's a very nice stat to have. And then it has like 2 relatively useless stats. And the damage to close, which is alright, nothing really crazy. So generally, daggers are inferior to swords, at least in the late game. They are better in the early game, but since we're talking about uniques, that doesn't matter. But the effect, 30% attack speed, is actually quite valuable. It is on a comparable level to some of the better legendary aspects. So something like accelerating, something like edge masters, these kind of effects. And attack speed does have extra benefits apart from DPS. You can trigger more siphoning strikes, for example. You can get more healing from that. You can get more exposure procs from that. So if you play like lucky hit based builds, where you just want to attack as much as possible, this can be relatively valuable. You can theoretically trigger this with something like dash and shadow step and these kind of things, even on a ranged build. But I tried that briefly and it didn't really feel that great. Like you just don't really have the consistent uptime on this, especially when there's only one target on the boss or so. It doesn't really work. So it's mostly for melee builds, or at the very least you need to have one melee skill in there. Then we have Frostburn. Frostburn is actually a really powerful item, but I don't think it's really that great for the rogue. You do have some cold synergies with Frigid Finesse, for example. So you could think about using Frigid Finesse for the extra 30% damage. That's a rather large multiplier. But the stats on this thing, yeah, you have crit, which is good, and everything else is kind of whatever. And then you have the lucky hit chance to freeze. So that can be quite nice. It makes everything safer, and you get a Frigid Finesse, but it doesn't really work on bosses. It can stagger bosses, I guess, so this is maybe a use for it. But most of the time, you just want to kill bosses instead of stagger them on a rogue, I would say. So it does have a bit of a niche use. It can be maybe included in like a support rogue build, I would say. Or for other classes, for something like Sorg or so, like having these freezes may be really powerful with aspect of control and stuff like that. For the most part, I have not used Frostburn. However, if you play like a really big lucky hit based build, again, something like Penetrating Shot with combo points, or Twisting Blades also has really good lucky hit chances. You combine this with something like Aspect of Shared Misery, where you can spread crowd control effects. It may be okay, but again, you lose 4 core skill ranks, which is like really a major issue for gloves. I think in general, these gloves need to be beefier. Like most legendary gloves are just not really great offensively, and missing those core skill ranks really makes them kind of weak. And this is one of those cases. Speaking of them, we have Grasp of Shadow. They have all core skill ranks, so they kind of solve that problem. And they have vulnerable damage, which is a very powerful stat. They have attack speed. Unfortunately, lacking crit, but I guess it's okay if you play around that a bit and have some other sources of crit. And then they have this lucky hit effect here where you create shadow clones of yourself that attack with whatever you used. Well, a lot of people ask me about this and they're like really hyped when they find this and they think that this is really good. And well, as I mentioned, the stats are okay. It's like relatively comparable to a real glove. But then you have this effect, and this effect does literally nothing. So there may be multiple bugs of this, or it might just be bad design. But those shadow clones, number one, when the target is dead and it procs, the clone will just disappear. It will not actually use its attack. Number two, even when it does use its attack, it doesn't really seem to do damage. And number three, it actually doesn't even have those upgrades that you have. For example, I tried this with Flurry, and Flurry usually is played with the 360-degree encircling blades aspect. And the shadow clone just uses Flurry without that. It doesn't get the aspect. And I guess it just doesn't really get like most of your aspects either, like that actually give you more damage or something like that. It's just a really, really weak item right now. It's a really cool item. I was actually relatively hyped for this item, but seeing how it works, I am not impressed at all. So I think it needs some major like fixing or buff or something like that. Like the fact that this is a lucky hit chance doesn't really make much sense. I think it should just be a flat chance. Maybe similar to Windforce as well. I think it should just be a flat chance instead of a lucky hit chance, so that it actually affects all of the skills kind of equally. Like you attack and you have a 30% chance that you spawn the shadow clone. Why does it have to be lucky hit? You know, it's gonna proc like 5 times more often on Penetrating Shot and Twisting Blades than on all the other core skills for no reason really. And if then those shadow clones actually do exactly the damage that you did, or have like the same multipliers at least, I think we can definitely talk about these gloves again. But for now, this is winter trash. Then we have Fist of Fate, another pair of gloves. This is actually a very interesting item. Unfortunately, I don't really think on the rogue. So I know that some people use that for like staggering bosses, or like Uber Lilith or something like that. You have the Mobilize proc, you have the Daze proc. So lots of lucky hit chances. Most of it is kind of whatever besides the Daze, and there are way better ways of getting Daze into a rogue build than this. but you have a really interesting effect here. So you do between 1 and 300% damage. And this means that on average, you do 150% damage. So it's actually a 50% damage multiplier. It's a very powerful item, especially if you don't use a core skill. Now, for rogues, there are not really builds that don't really rely on core skills. There is like one option, which is a poison trap build, which is something that I want to try with this glove. Because if you have like a full poison trap setup and then you get like a 50% multiplier that you otherwise wouldn't have, that is actually relatively powerful. But again, you lose core skill ranks, you lose crit, you lose attack speed. But mostly, I think this is again a case for other classes. Again, Sorks, for example, they have mastery skills. They actually have a viable basic skill build with Arclash. So this is where Fist of Fate really shines, in my opinion. Then we have Eyes in the Dark. Also one of those really common uniques, and Death Trap is really all the hype right now, so a lot of people are playing that. People ask me, is this a good item? And the answer is, hell no. So the thing is that most of the time, you never get this effect a single time in the dungeon, because the Death Trap actually does deal some relatively high damage. So it just kills something, you get a 10-second cooldown reset from Death Trap, and, well, you don't trigger this. So, first of all, the effect basically never does anything. And then you also have stats that are absolutely atrocious. So there is 0 damage reduction on this pair of pants, which means you take like something like more than double damage or so, because you don't have a defensive aspect, you don't have 4 defensive stats. This has kind of like the Temerity problem that I'm going to go into in a second. So basically, all you get with this pants is a lot more damage taken and a worse death trap. So this is, it's basically a downgrade in every regard for a rogue here. There is, however, one use case for Eyes in the Dark, which is cheesing your way through a tier 100 sniper dungeon very, very slowly. So theoretically, you can just kill monsters one by one by going, like, running in there with stealth or something, or CCing them with a smoke grenade, throw down a death trap, and then, you know, run away, wait like 5 minutes until the guy is dead, and then repeat that. And if you have like 20 hours to spend on a single run, then use those pants. Then we have Temerity. I already talked about these in another video, so this is a cross-class item actually. And I know that some builds use that, but I think on a rogue this is really bad, even though we have a lot of healing. So most rogue builds are relatively close range, and they have siphoning strikes, so you have insane amounts of healing, and you can actually build this barrier relatively easily. The problem with this pants is kind of similar to the Eyes in the Dark. It has 0 defensive value outside of that. So the barrier is relatively powerful, but it only scales with your base life, not with your actual maximum life. So I think this is like a general thing for barriers. This is just how they work. So when you have life bonuses from rubies, from paragons, from maximum life on your items, all of that stuff does not count. And, well, maximum life on items is a very good stat to have in late game. Stuff really hurts, and you want to have a good life pool. So you want to have a helm, you want to have maybe rings, chest, pants. There's 5 items where you can roll maximum life that can, I don't know, somewhat double your life or so with really good rolls. And this means that this 80% barrier goes down to something like at best 40%, 50% or so when you have a bunch of life rolls. So you may have something like a, you know, 15, 16k life character at level 100, but this barrier only has like 5k barrier or so when it's like fully stacked. So it doesn't really protect all that much of your life. And again, you lose 4 defensive stats that give you like, you know, something like 20% damage reduction each or somewhere along those lines. And you lose a legendary aspect as well that can give you another 20% damage reduction or so. So in the end, yeah, you take more than double damage. You have a barrier that protects like maybe a third of your life. And you also have to build that barrier between every single hit you take so that you actually get this full damage reduction value. In other words, it is a really weak survivability tool. So if you find this very early, let's say level 60, 70, maybe 80, you can use it for a while. But especially late game, once you start min-maxing, once you get more life on your gear, this becomes a worse and worse item. And, you know, towards level 100, you definitely want to get rid of these pants. Even if you want to use something like the conceded aspect, even if you're playing on softcore, I think it's just not a great choice. Then we have Penitent Greaves. I think this is a really powerful item. I put this into a lot of my builds, especially the melee builds. You get movement speed on evade. It's a nice combo. The rest of the stats are kind of weak, but it's a pair of boots. The stats don't matter too much beyond movement speed anyway. And then you can get this chill effect. And this chill effect has lots of different uses. You can get Umbral procs, so that's what I used, for example, for my recent Barrage Death Trap build. I used the Umbral Ring. You can just walk into a pack, and then you get resources from that. And of course, you proc Frigid Finesse, a really powerful passive. So you just get this by default. You get 15% extra damage. And if you have extra points to free up for this, then this is a really nice damage bonus, especially because the boots also give you damage. And most of the time, you don't really need that much on your boots in terms of like mobility or utility aspects, depends on the build a little bit, but it's a really nice offensive item in particular. If you already use some kind of cold effects, for example the Frostburn, or if you actually have like cold imbuement or so, I don't think it's really such a great choice, because then you already have 30 fitness uptime, and you can rather go for other pair of boots. As I mentioned, the stats are not too relevant, but you can get better stuff on your boots. But it can also be used to stagger bosses, for example. It has crowd control duration, so with a perfect roll and upgraded, this is 18%. That's a lot of extra stagger. And also this chill itself, it triggers, I think, every few seconds, I think every 3 seconds. You can get more stagger from just like standing under the boss. So for example, for Uber Lilith again or something like that, or if you just want to have like a really high stagger setup to kill bosses, then this is definitely a really good pair of boots. Then we have Mother's Embrace. So this is an item that you get after the campaign, so everyone has that. It's kind of an okay item to get started with, especially if you have a good roll. So if you use something like Penetrating Shot again or so, or even Twisting Blades, you will proc this effect sometimes, or even Flurry, but Flurry doesn't have much resource issues, I'd say. The stats are alright, again, nothing really crazy, but if you have this and you find like a good roll and you don't have any ring, and you want a bit of resources, it's okay. But that's about it. It's okay. I wouldn't really put this into like any kind of endgame build. You can figure out your resources with way better means and way better stats on your ring, with like, you know, crit chance is missing and vulnerable damage is missing, life is missing. So not really all that crazy, but here and there you might find a use for this. And lastly, we have the Word of Hakan. This is actually one of the most interesting uniques in my opinion. It allows Rain of Arrow to actually do anything. So that is kind of cool. It does have some okay stats with the crit damage, with imbued skills, and the all imbued skill ranks. Unfortunately, amulets have really powerful stuff that you're missing here. You don't have passive skills, for example. You don't have stuff like movement speed or energy cost reduction or cooldown reduction. So it does lack something like that. I think maybe this amulet could be buffed in some ways with that, with like, you know, this non-physical damage. Yeah, it's quite flavorful, but who really cares? And the same with the ultimate skill damage. So there could be maybe some better stats on this thing. Especially cooldown reduction would be great to have, because this is like one of the main things that holds back a Rain of Arrows build. I've actually tried this like a while ago, pre-nerf of Twisting Blades and all that. You could actually like reset Rain of Arrows relatively quickly and use it like every 10-15 seconds or so if you combine Twisting Blades with Preparation. Now this is not as feasible anymore because of the cooldown nerfs, and maybe you can use the Rain of Arrows, let's say every 20-30 seconds or so. And it is a really cool skill, so you can go check out the video. I have the link in the description if you want to see the build in action. It actually becomes relatively powerful with this amulet if you have the right combo. So the way that I would play this is like full investment into poisons and poison imbuement, and then a little bit here with like the shadow imbue with the explosions and the mixed shadow imbuement that gives you more damage, and then the cold imbuement here with the extra damage to crowd controlled enemies. And suddenly Rain of Arrows actually becomes a really powerful nuke ability, but unfortunately you can only use it very rarely. So you still have to complement this whole build with some actual like real core skill that does something. So maybe something like Twisting Blade or something like Barrage or even Pen Shot. You can do like some various combos here, but you need something to actually deal with packs and with bosses equally, because this is mostly like a pack clearing ability. So you can walk into like a huge room, press Rain of Arrows, everything dies. It's kind of cool, but not really one of the best builds, I would say. So it is a very fun item. Rain of Arrows in general is a really fun skill. Unfortunately, it's like the most undertuned skill on Rogue, and this item kind of makes it viable, but we have better stuff on the Rogue. Personally, I'm hoping that Blizzard buffs Rain of Arrows in general, so that it's actually like a useful tool for many builds and not just for a Word of Hakan only build. So especially the cooldown should be addressed maybe. It can definitely be lowered by quite a bit to be just more useful across the board. Maybe the knockdown can happen on the first wave, so that you actually get like a kind of panic button that protects you instead of waiting like 5 seconds for stuff to be CC'd. So there are some problems with the skill itself, but for the most part, really cool stuff you can do with Word of Hakan. I definitely want to try to explore this at some point and do like some full like Word of Hakan playthrough. Maybe starting from like level 60 onwards or so, whenever you find it for the first time, and just see how that goes. But for now, I'm working on other builds. And that's about it for all of the rogue uniques. There were some scattered in between, like those here that actually work for other classes as well. But yeah, for the most part, Rogue has relatively weak uniques. There are these 2 melee weapons in particular that are kind of interesting. There are the boots that are really powerful all around. And then everything else is kind of like whatever, or extremely niche, or really bad. So I think in general, maybe uniques should be looked at again, and there can definitely be some buffs to some of them. Maybe some tweaks to mechanics and all that stuff, as I mentioned, like Eyes in the Dark, Word of Hakan, the Windforce and Skyhunter bows. So bows in general could definitely be like improved a little bit with a better inherent stat maybe. So there are definitely some cases here. Maybe some of you guys found some great use case for some of those uniques that I didn't see coming or so. So let me know if you have any kind of cool build with stuff that I didn't explain here, or if you somehow managed to like fit in some of these uniques into your setups for like a good success. So that would be quite interesting to know. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.